David Malouf's writing has taken the form of short stories, novels, poetry, plays, libretti, and essays. It's a very diverse body of work, but at the same time, its themes and settings provide an underlying unity. No one has written better about Queensland, about its scents and sounds, the colour of its landscapes and skies, about its ambience than David, particularly in 12 Edmondson Street. And he's also written very movingly about conditions on the frontier. But David's work has not been parochial either in terms of Queensland or Australia. In The Great World, for example, he portrayed ordinary people born beyond Australia by events that they could not control and might only at best dimly comprehend. And in what remains for me his favourite work, An Imaginary Life, he succeeds in portraying what on the face of it seems impossible. He takes the situation of Ovid, the great poet of metropolitan Rome, exiled to the shore of the Black Sea, among people whose language and culture he cannot understand, nor they his, of course. And he shows how intimacy develops between the poet and a wild child who has no language at all, to the enrichment of the lives of both. It is a work of the highest achievement. So, in his various works, David Malouf has given us insights into the formative effects of childhood experience, the process of artistic creation, the pleasure and the pain of love, the withering absences of solitude and the comforts of companionship. That is, like all great artists, David Malouf has extended our understanding of what it is to be human. And if this were not enough, in his bio-lectures and in other essays, David has shown himself to be an astute commentator on history and culture, which brings us to today's lecture. David Malouf.
First of all, thank you all for coming here on this fine Sunday morning. Thanks also to La Trobe University for inviting me to do this lecture at the end of such a long and distinguished list of other lecturers. And I should say special thanks to Alan. He's an historian who's made us see the beginnings of this country in a completely new way. And I must say I've made use of what he has discovered several times in things I've wanted to say about Australia and about what we are and what we set out to do here. I'm responding this morning to a suggestion from Paul Kane that I might take up the question of Australian culture, where it is at the moment and where I think it might go. I should cover myself at the outset by saying that any view of something so large and nebulous is likely to be tentative and to come up with more questions than conclusions. But it's a subject, once we have settled in our minds what culture is and what our Australian version of it might encompass, that engages any of us who have an interest in music or the visual arts or a film or theatre or concert goers or simply readers. That is, if we take culture in its narrower sense for the moment of being what is self-consciously created in a society for its enlightenment and pleasure, or for the simpler reason that someone, some man or woman, has got caught up by the variety and mystery of things and finds joy and an enlightenment of their own in the making. I'll want to refer generally to the arts, but the one I know best is writing, and that will be central to what I have to say. I say writing rather than literature by strong preference. Literature is not a word I use very much. It's a grand, even inflated term that makes large claims for itself as a commodity with an established right to our attention and respect. I prefer the sense of immediate activity and individual presence that a word like writing speaks for. Those of us who have come late to the world, and I'm thinking here of nations as well as persons, do what writing or composing or painting we can in the present, knowing from the experience of other times and places that the future of what we make is in the hands and in the hearts, if we are lucky, of others. Literature, as opposed to writing, is created by readers who have been doing it for centuries, quite in their own way, and without the aid of either universities or arts committees. It is readers who decide what is living and will survive, what still speaks for a new present, as well as for its own time and in the largest and most human terms. In any particular language, it is the body of writing that speaks most directly to readers of the language, about the land, the landscape they inhabit, of local concerns and aspirations, of local triumphs or losses, but also of small daily concerns and private hurts and affections. What tells most richly the story of who they are and how they came to be so. It is that becomes a national literature. The body of writing as well that most richly embodies for its speakers the history and genius, the habits, rhythms, idioms, jokes, rhymes of the language they share. The great literatures that have come down to us from the past in Greek, Latin, English, French, Spanish, Homer and Aeschylus and Euripides and Plato and Thucydides and the Greek anthologists, Horace and Virgil and Ovid and Tacitus, François Villon and Montaigne, the poets of the Pléiade, Madame de Lafayette and Racine and Molière in French, and Chaucer and Shakespeare in English, and Cervantes and Lope de Vega and Calderon in Spanish, embody what has survived out of a mass of writings, because readers in those languages have not allowed them to die and have found them over long years indispensable to their notion of themselves and as records of their tribal or national experience. And because these are the poets, playwrights, storytellers, historians, and later philosophers and essay and letter writers who have come to seem most representative of them. Though none of the writers themselves, I guess, except perhaps for the historians and Virgil, had ever set out to be more than individual voices, speaking out of personal experience and as witnesses to living as it was to be observed in their own place and time. But by the middle of the 18th century, writers and commentators had become very self-conscious of the business of a nationally representative literature. It was the age, you might remember, of the first Shakespeare Festival at Stratford, which was managed by David Garrick, the actor, and of the apotheosis of Shakespeare as England's national genius. And at the same time, the emergence of new nations, especially later in the 19th century, and the creation of a national literature, like a national style in music, became part of the program of nation building. A writer in England or France, where the national literature was already defined, a Balzac or a Dickens, a Charlotte Bronte, Victor Hugo or Flaubert, could ignore the question of whether or not they were contributing to the national literature and get on with the more personal and practical business of writing itself. And English and French writers continue to enjoy that freedom today. But in the United States and in newly emergent nations in the early and later 19th century, like Russia or Germany or Italy or Scotland or Norway or Ireland, and even more in places like Canada and South Africa and Australia, the question of a national literature, what form it should take, the sort of language it should use, how it was to be made, and the place in it of any emerging writer was an immediate one, and the burden was laid on writers, on a Hawthorne and a Melville and a Mark Twain, on Gogol, on Ibsen, on Henry Lawson here, and Synge and Yeats and James Joyce in Ireland, on Thomas Mann. The burden was laid on them to go where Walter Scott had led the way and be in some way representative. Scott was the first, almost, of the writers to do that internationally. To speak for the consciousness, and the conscience too, at times, of the nation, as well as for themselves. And part of this burden, as we see in the case of Turgenev in Russia and Henry James in the US, was to conform and be representative, or to risk the charge of being unrepresentative and irrelevant. The question is, to what extent all this pressure was useful? First of all, to the creation of our literature, and then to the creation by writers of their best work. And secondly, when precisely the whole enterprise of a national literature is to be seen as so far established that it can be ignored by the individual writer for the simple reason that it is no longer in need of him, and the burden lifted from the writer of having any other obligation than to his own sensibility and interest, his own work. It was the generation of Bellow and Mailer and Updike and Roth free of this burden in the 80s, free of offering their readers, some contemporary version of the American dream and yet another incarnation of the great American novel. Our American writers look like Cormac McCarthy and Dan DeLillo, free of it today. Are we free of a similar burden here? And would being free enlarge or diminish our scope as writers? Our access to the sort of scope and concerns that might give our work importance, if that is what we are after, and a chance, if that is what we are after, at that elusive thing called greatness. As Sir Walter Scott discovered when he published the first of his Scottish novels in 1814, one advantage to a writer of having at his disposal a new and previously unexplored setting, and a society with its own tall tales and legends and dreams, its peculiar social tensions and customs and forms and lively vernacular, is the opportunity it offers to work both within and outside the established conventions, and the opportunity it offers readers to explore a new and previously undisclosed realm of the imagination and of living. The American novels and romances of the early 19th century, Cooper's Deerslayer novels, the emblematic tales of Washington Irving and Hawthorne, Melville's Moby Dick, Whitman's Leaves of Grass, with its evocation of American types and names and spaces, a little later Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi or Huckleberry Finn, find in the raw energy of the American scene, the adventuring of larger-than-life characters into the unknown, the dramatic confrontation of Indians, African blacks, and pioneers and Puritan Yankees, not only a new variety of epic, but a new form of lyrical pastoral that goes back to the remote beginning of things, to a world that is still in the making and still to be named, still opening itself up to human consciousness and socialization, still awaiting the stories and poems that will define and humanize and make a habitation of it. This new version of storytelling had an electric effect on readers, both at home in America and in Europe, as Scott's recreation of Scotland had had in the decade before. My mind goes to Schubert, sitting up on his deathbed in 1828, while his brother reads aloud to him the latest instalment of Natty Bumppo's Adventures among the Mohicans. It's one of those odd juxtapositions in our wider culture that we know too little about. We get some breath of all of this in Gogol's Ukrainian folk tales of 1831-32. The same evocation of new and previously unrecorded spaces, the sense of a world unnamed till now in literature, being mythologized as a mixture of folk humor and Gothic fantasy, like Hawthorne and the American humorists mixed. And 50 years later, there is that most American of our own 19th century fictions, Such is Life, which shares something of both these traditions, the playful and sometimes cruel humour of Mark Twain and the darker comedy of Gogol's Dead Souls. Tom Collins, the hero of Such is Life, you may remember, categorises himself as, in a very Russian way, a deputy assistant sub-inspector of the New South Wales Civil Service 9th class. But Furphy, by the end of the century, with his puns and double entendre and his multiple quotations from Shakespeare, is not only looking back to Melville or to Sterne, but forwards towards James Joyce. The great subject that 19th century American writing uncovered was the matter of America. American landscape, American unlimited lives, American dreams, seen in epic terms in Cooper or Melville, and in a darker light by Hawthorne, then satirically by Mark Twain, and with increasing subtlety and irony and skepticism by Henry James and a whole string of 20th century writers from Scott Fitzgerald to Bellow and Mailer and Roth. And this subject becomes the model for all the emergent literatures in Australia and Canada and South Africa, but also among the newly emergent nations in Europe. Balzac's subject in La Comédie Humaine is not the matter of France or what it means to be French, but the variety and tensions, the splendours and miseries of the economically expansive post-Napoleonic world he had grown up in, and of which he was just one self-made representative, the Napoleon of fiction, as his characters were variously the Napoleons of banking or of journalism or the law or medicine or politics or crime. The same might be said of Dickens and Thackeray and George Eliot and Trollope in England, and of later writers like E.M. Forster and Lawrence. Their novels deal with English manners and its social forms and movements, not with the matter of England. But central to all Russian writing in the 19th century, to take only one example, is Russia itself, the land of Rus, the myths and dreams of the great sleeping, stirring mass of the Russian people, what it means to be Russian, Russian soil, the Russian soul. A writer's vision of nation, of land, of a people and its consciousness, their shared stories and dreams, the extent to which he is a representative voice and witness to all this becomes the measure of his significance. And in this context, writers, as I suggested earlier, whose identification with nation is loose or ambiguous or ironic, a Turgenev or Henry James, or who are seen in some sense as cosmopolitan, are distrusted, as Heinrich Mann was, for example, compared to his brother Thomas, and as James Joyce deliberately set out to be, when he chose, in his own contradictory way, to be both the Irish writer of his city and his day, and at the same time to practice what he calls stillness, exile, cunning in far-off Trieste. Joyce, of course, practiced this double game to perfection and brought it off. More doubtful cases are our own expatriate writers, who are seen more simply as cutting themselves off from their roots. Rosa Prade, for example, or Martin Boyd, Henry Handel Richardson, Christina Stead. Is Morris Guest, which is my favourite of all Henry Handel Richardson's books, is Morris Guest in any way at all an Australian book? An example of Australian writing, yes, it can't help but be that. But does it belong to Australian literature? And what about Letty Fox, Her Luck? It's probably my favourite of all the Christina Stead novels, or The Man Who Loved Children, or Cotter's England. None of these books would qualify under the rules of the Miles Franklin Award, where the matter of Australia is essential and has until quite recently been narrowly defined.